Welcome to this presentation on using the graphic organizer for our free college essay. The graphic organizer, we used one for the first essay and they're pretty darn handy. For this essay, the graphic organizer is going to help us keep track of ideas, quotations, sources, but it's a little bit more involved, like there's more of it than there was for the first essay. Um, the graphic organizer is going to help us a lot because we're going to be encountering so many ideas in the sources that we read that it's impossible to keep track of what ideas we found interesting, um, or our reactions to those ideas unless we have some sort of system. Some people have really excellent note taking systems. Awesome. We're practicing a system with this graphic organizer. And the graphic organizer has 3 pages or 3 sections. So, this first page, you're going to keep track of ideas that you encounter that are in support of free college. Second page, you're going to keep track of ideas you encounter that are against the idea of free college or against it in part, at least. And then the final page that you're going to be filling out is about ideas regarding funding or paying for college, because the further you get into this essay, you're going to find out that it's not black and white. It's not pure free college, pure anti free college. A lot of the arguments we encounter or that we want to have on this topic are somewhere in the middle, and a lot of them involve how we pay for college, who pays for college, that kind of thing. So we want to keep track of those ideas as well. And as you're filling this out, there's a really good chance that you're going to need more than 1 page per thing. So you might need 2 pro pages or 2 con pages. If you fill it out digitally, like in Word, just keep going. It'll go to another page. If you prefer to handwrite your notes and you need another page, just print out another pro page or another ideas regarding funding page. Make it work for you. So the graphic organizer, uh, all 3 pages or all 3 sections have 3 columns. So this first column on every page is where you're going to record the idea that you encountered in one of the sources. So it can be a quotation, it can be a summary of the idea. We're going to encounter some charts. So if a chart was really interesting, if you're fancy and know how to copy and paste it effectively in there, you can. But quite frankly, I'm not. So I would just say something like chart showing blah, blah, blah. Then I'd move on. So summary, quote, that kind of thing. That's what you record in that first column. In the next column, this is where you make sure that, sorry, my little header at the top, I forgot to change, but this is where you give the source information. What is the author's name? If there is an author, was it an organization? And what is the title of the article? Because if you find a quote and you end up using it in your final essay, you're going to want to know where you got it so that you can cite it appropriately. So keep track of that information as well. And then for this final part, I'm really bad at changing the top part of this. I'm so sorry. This final column is where you are going to be recording your response or reaction to the idea that you put in the first column. So it can be like if you agree with the quote or idea, if you got new ideas based on what you read, if you disagree, if you felt like you need to clarify what they're saying, um, or if you read something and it reminded you of your own personal experience or something that you've observed, you can note that down. I also ended up, when I was filling one out, recording ideas that it gave me for my own essay, and I didn't want to forget those, so I wrote those down there as well. Okay, so we're going to look at each page specifically, and I'm going to show you an example of what I filled out when I was filling it out. So, for the example of, or this is the example of a pro or in support page. And I read the Bruning article for this example, and I found a quote that I thought was pretty interesting. And I copied and pasted the whole thing. Like it's pretty long. I don't think I would use a quote that long in my essay, but I was afraid that I wouldn't understand it if I quoted just a little bit of it. So even though I knew I wouldn't probably use the whole thing later, I put the whole thing here so that I understood it when I read it again. And you'll notice that I put quotations around it because I wanted to make it really clear for myself later on that this was a quote. And if I used any of it in my essay later, I had to put it in quotations in my essay as well. Okay, and then in the middle, I gave the author's name and the title of the article so I would remember it later. And then my response and reaction, it evolved as I was writing it. So I had some different moves going on here. And I started it by noting my response to the quotation. I found it interesting and I was like, oh, if they're going to argue this, it's about the quote was essentially saying that if people want to make college free, this is how they have to convince people to pay to make it free. But then they didn't say how they would convince people of that. So I noted, oh, I wonder how they're going to do that. Um, and then it made me think, oh, I wonder if I could do a move like that in my own argument essay, argue like how I would convince people that they should want to pay for free college for people. Like, how would I even go about that? So that got me going. And it even had me come up with an idea for a thesis if I wrote an essay about that. So I was like, oh my gosh, I better write this down before I lose track of it. And I was pretty informal. Like, I even said stuff like, hey, that could be a thesis. So feel free to record your thinking as you're going. This doesn't have to be formal. This is keeping track of interesting ideas and why you thought they were interesting. And after I came up with my thesis idea, I even had some ideas about the body of an essay and what kind of sources or quotations I would need if I wrote that essay. So I wrote them down. And you don't, you can come up with ideas and note them down. And it doesn't mean you have to write on that essay, but it's better to have more ideas than you need. So if you come up with a brilliant plan along the way, write it down. Don't feel like you have to stick with it. Write it down so that you can come back later and use it. You don't lose track of it. Okay, so one thing I want you to notice is in the middle column, I did point out which source it was, but I also pointed it out in the other two columns. Like I put the author's name attached to the paragraph because as I keep adding more stuff in the column in case the spacing gets off or something, I want to remember that this idea is attached to this article and to this quote. So this is to try and help me stay organized as I go on. All right, so this is the example for the con or against free college page. And here too, I copied and pasted the quotation in this column. but I didn't feel like I could get enough of the quotation in there to understand what he was really trying to do with that data. So, in my own words, I gave kind of a summary of his point and a reminder to myself of where he was going with this so that I would remember when I came back later. And you'll notice that I was very careful to put the exact quote in quotation marks to differentiate that from where it was my words. So I knew, hey, I have to quote this in the essay, but I don't have to quote my own words in the essay. I mean, I have to give credit if it's his idea, but still, I know when I'm using my words or his words. Again, I gave the author's name of the article because if you can't tell, I'm very concerned about forgetting things. So I try to give myself as many reminders of where things came from as possible. And then in the response section, I didn't so much have a response to the idea. I recorded the quotation because I thought that I would be able to use that data later. And so I wanted to capture that. And what I ended up doing is talking about how I would use the data. Now, just because I recorded this on my example against doesn't mean that's exactly what you have to do. But I'm trying to show you are different moves that you can make in this response reaction one. So far, we've actually gotten the response of like, oh, this is interesting because of this. I ended up doing some planning for a potential essay topic. Here I am recording this data and saying how I think it could be used in an essay. So those are all different moves you can make. All right. So this is the third section, funding ideas. And here, copied and pasted the quotation just like I did before. I felt I would understand it when I came back later, so I didn't add any information along with the quotation. Quoted the source again. And then for my response, here I noted how I could use the quotation. And in this case, I thought the quotation was actually a really good overview of different kind of points in this larger argument, and it felt like it was setting the stage, like getting people ready to understand things. And that made me think of like, hey, this could be a really cool quotation in my introduction or conclusion. So I wanted to remember it. And like I made a note of that on in my response and reaction. But then after I wrote that, I was like, hey, I actually have more thoughts about this. So I started a new paragraph and wrote about those thoughts. And if you kind of read the information, like I had questions. I don't know the answer to them yet, but maybe they would be something worth following up later. So note when you have questions. And then I realized, hey, this reminds me of something I just read in his source, and it seems connected to my response. So I ended up even adding a little quotation in my response reaction because I wanted to point out that, hey, it's connected to this too. So feel free to be pretty flexible in how you record ideas and responses and keep track of information. So, one thing you'll notice here is I was trying to show you how you could prepare if you ended up having more than one quote from an author in a category. So let's say in this first column, I found multiple quotations from Brunig that I wanted to include here. So I put this Brunig one to make note that this is the first quotation. And then you'll see over here, I put Brunig one along with these paragraphs to show that it was attached to this Brunig quote. So if I had a second Brunig quote, I would say Brunig 2, and then any responses I had over here, I would label them Brunig 2 as well. I'm trying to keep myself super organized. That is something that is so important when you're using sources because if you don't do the work to stay organized in the beginning, you're going to spend that time frantically searching at the last minute to try and figure out what goes with what and what came from where. It's easier to put in the work to start with. It may have taken me a few years to really accept that fact, but I have, and I'm here to tell you it is worth doing. All right, so that is the end of the presentation on using the graphic organizer. Remember, um, there is the example that I made that I referenced in this presentation. It will also be attached to this item in Blackboard, so you can check it out and read it more at your leisure if you would like.